Your Lie in April began as a manga series in Monthly Shonen Magazine, starting in 2011 and ending in February 2015. The animated adaptation by A1 Pictures started in October of 2014 and ended 1 month after the manga. That May, a single-episode OVA called Moments was released, acting as a prequel for the series. Your Lie in April is rare in that it's both incredibly popular and well-liked to a degree I don't see often. I was among those who quite liked the show after first watching it in May of last year, however my opinions have gradually shifted. By the time I've rewatched the show just a few weeks ago, I was stunned by the fact that I no longer enjoyed it much at all. But while my personal perception shifted to the negative, it begs the question of why I like the show so much in the first place, or why the consensus is so positive. I just had to get to the bottom of this, so now we're starting off with this guy. The main protagonist of Your Lie in April is Arima Kosei, a genius piano player who is no longer able to hear his own music after the trauma inflicted by his sickly mother and her subsequent death 2 years before the start of the story. Things start to turn around for him when he meets Miyazono Kaori, the pushy, energetic violinist who drags him back into the world of music, though she herself is dying of an undefined disease. Finishing up the main cast, Sawabe Tsubaki and Watari Ryota are both sporty childhood friends of Kosei. Tsubaki is a baseball player who is in love with Kosei despite not realizing it for most of the story, while Ryota is a woman-crazed soccer star. A bit later, when Kosei starts going back to the concert hall, we are introduced to his rivals in piano playing, Igawa Emi and Aiza Takashi. Emi likes Kosei for inspiring her to play the piano, while Takashi sees Kosei as a worthy opponent. Arimasaki, Kosei's mother, shows up in flashbacks post-mortem. Later, an old friend of hers, Seto Hiroko, becomes Kosei's mentor to amend her past mistakes. Also showing up in the second half is Aiza Nagi, Takashi's younger sister, the bratty girl becoming Kosei's pupil. The second half also gives more screen time to Kashiwagi Nao, who briefly shows up in the first half. To say Kosei is at the core of the story is no understatement. Aside from a few exceptions, most characters in the show can be referred to through their connection with Kosei. While his relationship with Kaori is the inciting incident, more relevant to the backstory is his relationship to his mother Saki. And while she isn't the worst part of the series, it's not for lack of trying. The first half of the show sets her up as a one-dimensional monster with a generic motive, pushing Kosei to be a great pianist because she can't due to her crippling, undefined illness. Her abuse is both physical and emotional, but how it manifests on Kosei isn't always sensible. While he's generally on the muted side emotionally, as the show continues, we see how broken Kosei really is, both in ways deliberate and possibly unintentional. The biggest is in his piano playing, as after a short while of playing, he becomes deaf to his own music. The show often stops to ask why these musicians play, and without his mother pushing him, Kosei has lost that reason. This is pushed along by a line from the first episode stating that, "When you're in love, everything looks colorful." As such, when we see Saki, more often than not she's shown in washed-out colors, and yet despite that lost love, Kosei still talks to his mother's altar 2 years after her death in the opening episode. This might be a point toward how emotionally damaged he is, but it still feels at odds with the Kosei who's abandoned the piano for 2 years. As a one-dimensional character, Saki is uninteresting although important to the plot, but as the show later attempts to make her sympathetic, it fails miserably. The first time we see her in color, it's not as obvious. The Saki here has yet to be gripped by her sickness, so she can still smile. This characterization makes her slipping into her cruel self seem more tragic, and at this point, Kosei seems to want to remember her for who she was over what she became. However, after the conclusion of the first major arc, we are given some revelations into her character that just don't add up. When a young Kosei wishes death upon his mother after being beaten in public, Saki smiles at him, glad that he's finally growing up as a person. And yet her being happy about her son wanting her dead after hitting him to the point of bleeding just makes her seem deranged. To compound this, during the same event, extended slowly over the course of several episodes through flashbacks, Seto finally calls her out and Saki breaks down crying about how little time she has left. Despite being aware enough that Kosei needs to grow as a person and as a pianist, her idea of growth is apparently abusing him to the point where it's not too unbelievable that he might have killed her or himself, especially when you account for Japan's infamously high suicide rate. Spending her last days perpetuating that abuse only makes her incompetence just that much more noticeable, yet the show wants you to feel sympathetic for her as Kosei does, ultimately forgiving her. Had the show kept Saki as a one-dimensional character, or at least one driven by an obsession over her son and pupil, I'd honestly be a bit more satisfied with that than the incompetent, bipolar, short-sighted idiot we got. What makes it even more egregious is the lack of Kosei's father. In episode 1, Kosei says his dad will be back in a month or 2. However, aside from a brief glimpse in the OVA, he isn't as much as mentioned again, let alone appearing, despite much more than 2 months passing. Kosei's father showing up could have done a lot for Saki's character and her relationship with Kosei. Why did he fall in love with her? How did he feel about losing her? How did he feel about her treatment of Kosei in his constant absence? Your guess is as good as mine. Magnifying things as if being unable to play the piano weren't bad enough, he's just so broken it's honestly depressing. If it felt entirely intentional, then there wouldn't be too much to say about it, but the show itself seems completely unaware of how damaged this kid is. His abuse is often symbolized in the form of recurring black cats. After bringing one home as a child and naming it Chelsea, she scratched his precious piano-playing hand, and Saki took her away, never to be seen again. When it comes to his piano playing or Chelsea, these scenes have a fitting dramatic weight. If all Saki ever did was abuse him emotionally, there'd be no failure in the narrative here, but if there's one thing rewatching Your Lie in April has taught me, it's that slapstick comedy and a character arc involving physical abuse do not mix. The very first scene of Kosei interacting with his friends involves him bleeding on the floor, and there's more blood here than in any serious scene that uses blood. In fact, there's far more blood in the slapstick scenes than there are in the rest of the show combined. How are we supposed to find this funny while also finding this shocking or sad? I have to highlight Tsubaki in particular here. Even more than Seto, Tsubaki is the character most aware of Kosei's abuse, yet she too abuses him constantly. She's definitely aware of it. In episode 1, she warns Kosei against picking up broken glass, presumably after having been scolded by Saki so many times for potentially damaging Kosei's hands, even though at this point he hasn't really played the piano in 2 years. She's perfectly willing to damage the rest of him though. Kaori is too, but to be fair, she doesn't really know the full story. However, that doesn't make Kosei's reaction to it very reasonable. The only way I can justify him brushing it off is that he's so used to it. He admits as much when it comes to the emotional side of his abuse. After ruining Kaori's performance by stopping midway and taking note of her lack of reaction, he says, "It would be easier if she chewed me out." If there's any one thing that's guaranteed to get an emotional reaction out of someone, it's pain, but Kosei just brushes it off, except in the one scene with his mother. By the end of the show, he's overcome some of his abuse, but what wasn't addressed makes it harder to accept the growth that he supposedly went through. That said, even if Kosei weren't a victim of abuse in his backstory, slapstick humor largely works because the one dishing out tends to be weaker than the one taking it. While Tsubaki is a girl, she's a sporty one, so I have no reason to assume she's somehow weaker than Kosei. If the original author wanted to do slapstick comedy so badly, it would have been much more wisely directed at Ryota. The guy doesn't get enough screen time as it is, and his ADD attitude toward cute girls of any age could probably be expanded on in ways that deserve the occasional pounding. And given that he's sporty, he's probably built more to taking it than Kosei is. Now, while Saki is certainly bad, Tsubaki somehow manages to be even worse. I've already touched upon her slapstick abuse of Kosei, but we're just getting started. When she's at her best, she's usually far away from Kosei. When an old upperclassman comes back to her, she decides to go out with him even though her feelings are no longer as strong. Across the 10 episodes after they get together, any scene spent between them involves her either ranting in frustration or raving in praise exclusively about Kosei until he unceremoniously dumps her. Beyond that arc and her feelings toward Kosei, she's either acting as a vehicle for slapstick comedy or she's busy making herself out to be a victim in ways just as out of place. While Kosei is busy overcoming his mom's abuse or Kaori is trying not to keel over and die, Tsubaki's constantly whining about things that are either no longer important or entirely her fault. She blames music for taking Kosei away, even though he had just spent the last 2 years hanging out with her and Ryota as just a fairly normal kid who previously played the piano. Despite not liking Saki, she treats Kosei just as badly as she did, only getting a pass because it's framed as a joke. After finally realizing she likes Kosei and confessing to him, she gives him lasting damage in the form of a strong kick, which now takes note of later, yet neither her nor Kosei even care. Then, in one of the most infuriating scenes I've ever seen, she claims she went through a lot of suffering because of Kosei. She's the one who spent 2.5 years not confessing to him. She never made any sacrifices to try and understand music aside from going to the occasional concert. But she's the one who's suffering? Fucking Nao tends to know more about music than Tsubaki. She explains to her about the music-focused high school Kosei might go to, and she somehow discovers that Kosei is tutoring Nagi out of nowhere. Nao feels like the only female character who's not interested in Kosei, but she'd probably still be a better match for him than Tsubaki. Kosei never even seems to care for Tsubaki beyond as a friend anyway. When Kosei is starting to feel that music is taking away the ones he loves, we get shots of Kaori and Saki, but not Tsubaki, even though she feels as though music is taking him away from her. The first thing Tsubaki's confession manages to accomplish is pushing Kosei to admit he likes Kaori. After all the emotional payoff between Kosei and Kaori, his decision to get with Tsubaki in the end feels like it's either out of pity or fear. Thankfully, Kaori is more prominent than Tsubaki, as she is both a bit more likable and interesting, but I'd hesitate to call her character good. She is the heart of the story, and while there are some issues with her character arc, and the story overall, at the end of the day I don't dislike her. For instance, she does a good job of embodying the themes of the show. If I had to boil the theme down, I would describe the most significant and well-handled theme as Carpe Diem, seize the day. After finding out that she doesn't have long to live, Kaori decides to move forward with what time she does have left, getting into playing the violin more strongly and reaching out to Kosei. Her influence, in turn, inspires Kosei to seize his own day, returning to the world of competitive piano playing. As Kaori's sickness begins to take its toll on her health and spirit, Kosei in turn helps her through it. Tsubaki finally musters up the courage to confess to Kosei, who at the end of the show makes a strong return and solidifies his place in the competitive piano world while Kaori dies. And that's where it misses its step. By all accounts, for following through with the themes of the show, Kaori staking it all on continuing the violin, even at the risk of her own life, she should be rewarded. Tsubaki followed through with the themes of the show and ended up with Kosei against all logic. Even Saki, who lived the last of her days for Kosei's tomorrow, seems to have been rewarded through Kosei's acceptance and success, though her method could have been better. With Kaori, however, it comes off as aggressively forced for the sake of being tragic. Keeping her alive would feel like a cop-out, so the author probably felt like he had no choice, but he did. He's the writer. If I were to suggest something that would be even more tragic while also fitting in with the themes of the show, I would have Kaori go through with her suggestion of suicide. Remove any mention of the vague operation to her vague sickness and you've got something that's both tragic, understandable to her character, and still fitting the themes of the show. The fact that her death was basically a coin flip implies themes of fate, but those work against the show. Otherwise, you could argue that Kosei was fated to plod along without playing the piano for the rest of his life. Even though she couldn't play the violin, she'd still be cutting herself off from even one more moment with Kosei, failing to seize her own day. Though tragic, it would be thematically appropriate. If it were time before Kosei's last concert, his success in overcoming that which broke him last time would make the events that much stronger. Instead, we got a tragedy that happened not for the sake of the show, but for the sake of tragedy. That said, it's possible that something along these lines could have been planned for the original manga, but the editor decided against it, or it was changed for the adaptation. Even so, what we got cannot be called satisfying. While Kaori's character arc needed work, you could say the same for all the shafted side characters. Ryota and Emi in particular get pretty much nothing in the second half of the show. Ryota fawns over just about every female character, loses a soccer game, and helps Kosei with Kaori, but that's about it across the whole show. Kind of a wonder why he was even in the main cast. Emi, after being introduced and sneaking into a violin concert in which Kosei was set to perform with Kaori, does nothing but be there during the piano concerts. As far as characters with low screen time go, Nao has to be the most surreal part of the show for me. She's completely forgettable. She first shows up in a chunk of episode 5, but isn't named until later in the episode. She returns for a handful of scenes in episode 6, but after this she doesn't make a single appearance until episode 12, where she pops up during the opening theme before inexplicably joining up with the main cast as they hang out with zero explanation. The best I can figure is that she liked the atmosphere around them and happened to be there when Kaori suggested an activity for them. However, from a narrative standpoint, she only exists in these scenes to say things the other characters can't, and her inclusion only highlights flaws in the character dynamic between the main four. She asks about Kaori's and Kosei's future in the fireworks scene, she points out to Tsubaki that she likes Kosei, she starts showing up at concerts despite clearly having no interest in music. Nao only exists for the exposition she gives. Her smidgen of personality is overwritten by the fact that she is not a character. She is a mouthpiece for the author when he needs something specific to be said that none of the other characters can say. I think the fact that I completely forgot about her until episode 12 despite her appearances in episode 5 and 6, even though I'd watched the entire show before, says a lot. In retrospect, the best way to handle Nao would be to tear her apart and dole out her roles in the show to other characters. A more romantically aware Ryota would be forced to manage the love triangle between his friends, and it would fit the fact that he doesn't seem to have an interest in Kaori beyond friendship. When Kosei tells him that he likes Kaori, Ryota says it was obvious, but we never know for sure how long he knew. He was continuing to chase girls as soon as the day after he met her, so it's unclear if he knew since the start or if he's just a dick. If he were more romantically aware, his actions would make more sense and he'd get more screen time as he pushed the three in ways to satisfy all of them. Putting Emi in Nao's place would add another layer to the joke that Kosei didn't recognize his two strongest rivals at all despite their childhoods playing piano. Emi being both a schoolmate and a rival would be just that much more amusing in his ignorance. Tacking her onto the main cast would also give her more screen time, offer some musical perspective in the second half that Kaori isn't around to give, and keep Emi from getting upstaged by Takashi. If Tsubaki was more willing to put in effort to know about music, or even just Kosei's school, it would hold a bit more weight when it comes to her interest in him. Isn't love about making concessions and sacrifices for someone because the time spent with them, good or bad, is more worthwhile than time spent without them? Doesn't that perfectly fit with the themes of the show? Instead, it's just squandered. In talking about themes that weren't completely squandered, I have to admit Takashi's character arc almost works. When Kosei comes back into the fray, Takashi opts out on going overseas, threatening his career for a chance to go up against Kosei after his hiatus. But after he fails to make it past the preliminaries due to inconsistency, Takashi is initially disappointed and falls into a slump of his own when he realizes his choice may not have been worth it. Nagi, however, takes on the challenge. She makes some leaps in skill after learning from Kosei and performs with him right in front of her brother, ultimately inspiring him to keep going, not so different from what Kosei simultaneously did with Kaori. That said, nothing really comes of it. Takashi is back to form again, he gets a nice performance scene as a result, then nothing. The same could be said of Nagi, but despite getting even more focus, her arc just kind of flounders around. She meets Kosei and Seto in the first place due to some seemingly random happenings, and her taking advantage of the situation is natural, but it comes across as somehow being planned. Kosei is able to use this to push along Kaori when she needs it the most, as hard as it is for her, just like it was for him when she did the exact same thing. But as a result, Nagi's just kind of there. She gets compared to Kosei in his youth, but nothing really happens beyond Seto avoiding the same mistakes she made with Kosei. Kosei himself doesn't seem to get any insights from either Takashi or Nagi, and we don't learn anything about his character that we don't already know. It all comes across as padding, filling in the gaps between the Kaori and Tsubaki scenes so Kosei isn't just sitting around the whole time. There are some other themes briefly touched upon across the show, such as music is freedom, which brings up a conflict between traditionalism and originality, but neither of these are developed. If anything, they're contradicted. Kaori's loose playstyle is loved by the crowd, but it doesn't go over well with judges, while the young Kosei's strict by-the-book performances are loved by judges but earn him ire from the crowds due to his perfection. Even Emi has a brief moment with an angry judge. However, in the end, despite Kosei's final performance, both enthralling the crowd and winning over the judges, how this presumably happened is never brought up at all. The questions it brings up are just dropped, even though, again, this is something that would work with the show. Why stay with what's stagnant and boring when we can make new things for tomorrow? But should we forget the past in our efforts to seize today? Don't ask me. As far as the music is freedom bit itself goes, I can't help but be overly disappointed. While it serves as motivation for the characters to play how they play, it's just completely ignored during the concert sequences. These are probably the best parts of the show, which make the largest flaw of Your Lie in April just that much more apparent. It's not any of the characters, though not for Tsubaki or Saki's lack of trying, it's the dialogue and script. So often the show just seems to think it's an audio drama instead of an anime. The characters are constantly talking or thinking, and there are so few stretches of the show that omit dialogue or narration. The worst part about it is there's nothing about the plot or characters complex enough to warrant it. Girl meets boy. Girl helps boy. Boy helps girl. Girl dies. Boy gets on with other girl. Even though the source material is written for preteens at youngest, the animated adaptation airs in the middle of the night, and I doubt even teens who like the show are going to buy the discs. So why drown those scenes out with overly frequent, bland, and on-the-nose dialogue? Why bloat runtime with obnoxious flashbacks that make the repeated imagery tired instead of meaningful? And when it isn't on the nose, it's forced purple prose that just smashes my suspension of disbelief. Why are two middle schoolers debating about the emotions that Piano is feeling? Why is Tsubaki of all fucking characters claiming spring is coming when considering the beginning of Kaori and Kosei's antics in the music world? And why is she stating, the rain tastes like lemonade, to refer to something nostalgic? It's not natural or clever dialogue. But the worst offender is during the concert pieces. Classical music is considered to be high art like few other genres of media, and the existence of the show is evidence. Even doing no research beyond the show, it's fascinating to me that Japan has so readily accepted Western classical music. If that isn't a statement of its quality, I don't know what is. So when I hear the dialogue and narration constantly run over its concert pieces, making it harder to focus on the music, it shows a lack of respect both for the music and its audience that I ultimately cannot forgive. The obtrusive and often unnecessary dialogue subtracts from these concert scenes nearly every time it's used. Rather than let the audience use music pieces and visual direction to infer what's going on, keeping the dialogue to a bare minimum, it has a constant need to narrate the obvious, calling attention to itself. The reasons for why this happened are pretty obvious. In a musicless manga, dialogue and narration would be far more necessary, but in the adaptation these were copied over clumsily and carelessly. The sad part is that otherwise, the concert scenes are very well directed. The fast shots keep things moving when in truth so little is, and the visuals are kept interesting. I can even look past the CG hands because they too keep the shots dynamic. The only alternatives would be lazy panning shots or this framey garbage. The result is scenes that are fun to watch but not listen to. And this doesn't just refer to the concert scenes either. Frankly, the show treats its viewers like they're idiots. Very little goes unsaid. Good dialogue would work with the show, not in opposition. It's not even that the visual direction is bad. In fact, I want to highlight one of the best shots in the show. In episode 12, Kaori and Kosei are asked about their respective futures while the gang is playing with fireworks. After being asked, Kaori's sparkler goes out as she claims she's not thinking about her future for obvious reasons in retrospect. She then snatches Kosei's sparkler, holding it up and sharing her more immediate future plans. It's a clever scene, but I have one question. Where was the person who directed it during the rest of the show, huh? Really, though, it's just that with Kaori's upcoming death, the show decided to have some discretion. And the fact is, with a few alterations, many of the scenes would work fine just as they are. At the end of episode 13, Seto is giving a monologue while we're given a perfectly serviceable scene of Kosei rushing to the hospital to go see Kaori. It's plenty easy to follow, but in the beginning of episode 14, we're given effectively the exact same scene, but in a more typical style of the show, it's overloaded with needless dialogue. Otherwise, all that really changes in the new version of the scene is we see a bit of Tsubaki being miffed about Kosei clearly being more concerned for Kaori, and there's a more direct comparison between Saki and Kaori. Truth is, though, I see no reason for these two things not to work without the extra dialogue. The only explanation that I have is that either the director or the original author felt that their audience wouldn't get it without cramming the series with so much dialogue. Even if you consider the teen and preteen audience of the source material, it feels condescending. Now, while there tends to be good visual direction, in some other areas I found the show a bit lacking. The colors are appealing and vibrant, but about all the show does with them is wash them out, even though there's more work to be done that just isn't accounted for. If the world is more colorful when you're in love, then the first episode, which says this line twice, failed to really go through with it. For instance, had the show used a more drab color palette before Kosei first saw Kaori, it could have worked. But in this way, among others, the first episode actually feels overproduced. Also in that scene you have Kaori playing flawlessly alongside a handful of children. Considering how much of the show focuses on the characters working hard to get better, this has me scratching my head. The show also continues to screw up later. In episode 8, Emi gives a performance where her plane glows with red and yellow. If you took your basic knowledge of color symbolism and assumed it meant that the performance was supposed to be angry yet happy, you are only half right. Kaori claims that the yellow is meant to represent loneliness. This isn't some weird Japanese quirk either. Yellow typically represents courage or happiness in Japan, and other scenes using that color seem to be going for that vibe over loneliness. Unusual color symbolism is something I'm more than open to, but it needs consistency across the entire work in question for it to flow. What exactly is lonely about the music room or the Miyazono family cake shop? Loneliness is more typically represented with darker colors, and this usage is more frequent across the show. And speaking of darker colors, let's talk about that cat. While it's never certain if any of the black cats dotting the city are Chelsea, the town seems to be black cat central. For obvious reasons, they typically show up in regards to the relationship between Kosei and Saki, but this isn't always the case. He sees one in episode 2 after really playing the piano for the first time since his hiatus. In 3 and 7, one serves as his inner voice and later triggers a panic attack. Even in episode 1, Kaori is chasing around a black cat, mirroring her affection towards Kosei. There's also one in the opening theme. After Kosei overcomes his trauma in episode 13, however, in Nagi's first appearance, a black cat draws her to Kosei while also appearing when he is told to serve as her teacher. In episode 20, one shows up licking its paw while Tsubaki is confessing to Kosei. Later, one is nuzzling up to Kosei while he's on the phone with Kaori. It's later hit by some bad luck and dies in the appropriate medical institution, clearly meant to evoke Kaori herself even though she's never been represented by a black cat before. If the color of the cats were changed beyond the eyes, it might have worked, but there's no consistency there either. The ones in episode 3 and 7 are green-eyed, but the rest are blue-eyed whether they're connected to Kosei or not. Lastly, in the final episode, there's one that runs away, clearly mirroring the one that Kaori saw in episode 1. I thought it might be representing Kaori leaving Kosei, but now if all the blue-eyed cats are Kaori, then she's chasing herself? Did Nagi even... What a mess. The devil is really in the details because even when it comes to the parts of the show I like, there's always something holding it back. I'm not going to beat around the bush here. The character designs are fucking adorable. It's mostly a holdover from the manga, of course, but there's a grounded feeling to most of the hair colors and styles with the exceptions of Takashi's Final Fantasy hair. The definition given to the noses and lips isn't something I see that often either. They do get deformed during the funny bits, though, and some of the times, what the fuck? Nagi's nose is less defined than the older characters, and the children often take the simplification of features to the extreme. These simple expressions are generally cute, but there's a clear clash whenever the main characters are involved because they're too important to simplify. I've commented on the show's lack of care for its music before, but that doesn't extend to the OP or OST in general. The original soundtrack is generally pretty good, and while some of the notable tracks do start to wear on as you're hearing them for the 4th or 5th time, I still feel as though they're solid overall. There are still some annoying missteps, though. While episode 1 has a scene of Kaori playing with the kids, it also has Kosei's MP3 player. The only track that's on it apparently is the first opening theme, and it is a nice song. But after some casual abuse, Tsubaki listens to some of it and comments on the fact that Kosei is listening to the new Millions song. There's a clear pause in the audio of the MP3 player before and after this moment, as if to distract you from the fact that the OP is actually done by Goose House. It's just another example of the show refusing to utilize its medium and continue to stick as closely to the source material as possible regardless of how much sense it makes. Oh yeah, and speaking of musical failures... Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. If you thought that was bad, then imagine at full length, several more times. Normally I find English more endearing than not, but this time it was pretty painful. Now, although I hate to inject it without much cohesion, I think this fits the moment's OVA. If you liked seeing the characters as kids, well, look no further. Aside from reusing some shots from the show, it mostly focuses on the struggles of young Emi and Takashi. It doesn't have much new, and it seems to be setting up things that never happen. The abrupt ending made me think of the terrible events that come after, but the saccharine OVA seems to want to ignore them. It's nothing more than a cash grab to capitalize on the popularity of the series. And when it comes to the popularity of Your Lie in April, I just can't help but wonder why at this point. And for that matter, why did I like it so much last year when it has such glaring issues? I think it has to do with the current state of the Western anime fandom. Romantic dramas are nothing new if you've been watching anime these last 10 years. Since the mega hits Sword Art Online, Attack on Titan, and Kill la Kill brought in so many new fans, have there been that many well-produced romantic dramas? There have been romances and dramas, but there haven't been as many both as recent and as crisp looking as Your Lie in April. Looking this good is going to appeal to someone no matter what, and it utilizes tropes and cliches that someone unfamiliar with the genre or less familiar with anime in general might not have seen as much. It has a little sister character, a big sister character, tsunderes in chocolate and vanilla, a few other girls with cute character designs for good measure. The main protagonist is genius but tortured and troubled. It has unrequited love, the Japanese cold, and even the ever-vengeful Japanese automobile makes a cameo appearance near the end. All of these combined in a pretty package with some occasionally good direction is probably enough for people to overlook the crap dialogue and the offensively unlikable characters. I personally only got into anime in 2012 despite having read manga since the mid-2000s. Of course I liked the show my first time through. Ultimately, my disappointment in Your Lie in April is pretty immense. For every good aspect, I think of something else dragging it down. For every bad aspect, there's something else making it even worse. I can't really recommend it in good conscience unless you have very specific tastes. I would sooner recommend you find something better, but on the bright side, if you are wowed by this show, then you've got a whole medium filled with series that do everything this show did and more, and that's something to be excited about.